Hey guys, this is Isaac. Wanted to go ahead and give a preview video for this next week and the Year in the Bible series. We were just getting ready to start in Leviticus, and Leviticus is a crazy book of the Bible where we got all these laws that seem so outdated, that seem to have no relevance, to seem to be confusing, especially for Christians today, where we say, what is this all for? What is the point of all this stuff? And one thing I really want to do is not just go ahead and jump to the New Testament and say, okay, these laws are outdated, we have Jesus, and all things are good. There's so much to learn here as far as the character of who God is, what God's relationship with man is like, and I just wanted to camp out a little bit. There wasn't enough time to go ahead and do a whole preview because we're covering so many chapters in each week's study, but I wanted to go ahead and say, all right, let's separate some ideas ahead of time so that when we embark on Leviticus this week, we can have some thoughts in our brain as far as what this all means, how is this in context, how do we read this, how do we understand this, how do we kind of wade through a lot of these confusing sections. So I wanted to give a little prep video. So to do that, we really need to camp out a significant amount in God's holiness. So the holiness of God is really at the heart of Leviticus. There's a couple key phrases that God says to his people, and Moses speaks and says, let them be holy as I am holy. God is speaking, saying, I am holy. And even that context is communicated again in the New Testament and First Peter and other locations. So God's whole desire with the people throughout all of history is for them to be in holy relationship with him. So what holy means is it really means of being a set apart. It means being at distance, meaning being unique. So what God is saying is he is holy in that his presence is holy, his location is holy, the space he takes up is holy. Now the problem here in Leviticus is Israel is not holy. They are unclean or impure. And that's kind of the point of this book, is to say, how do we reconcile an unholy, impure, unclean people to a holy, pure, and clean God who's the creator of all? So this is God's plea with humanity on how can we reconcile this relationship, especially as we just read through in Exodus, where God has now set up his location, his proximity in the midst of his people. So since the beginning of creation, God has never been in the midst of his people. So for the first time, we have God in the presence, and now God is saying, now that I am in the presence, you have to become holy like me for us to have relationship. Because I am here, because my presence is naturally holy, I cannot be separated from you and still be able to be in relationship with you. So basically what this whole book is trying to say is how can we reconcile God's holiness with our, or Israel at the time, unholiness? So to be pure in this in Leviticus, you'll go through things as far as ritual purity and purity from disease, purity from death. So all these things as far as cleansing, you'll see that pretty much all of them have to do with some kind of disease or death or something like that. And the reason why God is saying you have to be clean is those kind of things are impure because they represent death. They represent not a life-giving substance. And God in his holiness is pure life. So what even we have in the ritual purity is, hey, you have to clean yourself after you touch any kind of mold, any kind of dead people or dead animals, any of those things that represent death or represent any kind of decay or disease. God says, because of my nature being holy and clean, you have to put away those things, or you have to wash yourself in order to have relationship with me. You see this in even the relationship with Moses. So at the end in Exodus 34, Exodus 40, right at the end, it says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of the meeting. So we have that at the beginning of Exodus. Then in chapter 1 of Leviticus, it says, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from outside the tent of meeting. So you can see here, even with Israel's impurities, Moses and God's relationship is from outside of the tent. So God has set up this tabernacle as a place of holiness, a location of his goodness, his cleanness, his pureness. And he set up this location in the midst, and he's saying, Moses, even as my intercessor to the Israelite people, even you cannot come into the temple. Even you have to be outside the temple. Well, what's interesting is the very first line of Numbers, which is the very next book. You can see here, sorry, let me turn that way. It says here that, and the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai inside the tent of meeting. So basically, we have this book between Exodus, where Moses is outside as the intercessor, and now we have Moses being inside of God's presence as the intercessor. So something happens in the book of Leviticus that reconciles that relationship. It's almost like God is saying, all right, we're going to put the relationship back together, and the way to do this is through these sacrifices. And I know it seems really foreign to go through these sacrifices of how that happens and what happens there. So I'm going to give you kind of two examples here, and I'm going to kind of give you a little narrative through the holiness of God and how that eventually is reconciled ultimately. So I want you to take a minute and think of the sun. So the sun is basically what our cosmos revolves around. The sun is absolutely powerful, where obviously we know that you cannot get close to the sun or you would just be scorched. So the sun is also destructive. It is all these things that are really negative because of its power and beauty and capability. But also the sun is life-giving. It makes our whole universe breathe life, breathe vegetation, give energy, all of those things. So the sun is both powerful, but also life-giving. So basically, if we are not like the sun, if you just think about this, if we're not like it, we will be destroyed by the sun. But if we are like the sun, then we can be in close proximity to the sun. So what God is saying, even in the burning bush analogy, is God says to Moses, do not come any closer to me. Don't come any closer. I am so holy that if you get in close proximity with me, then you will be burnt up. So God in his goodness and his creational power and majesty says there has to be a barrier between God and man, because right now there's a unreconciled relationship. So same thing with the sun is when we are transformed to be sons, we are able to bring warmth and life to creation and things like that. So think of the sun where it is ultimately powerful, but also so life-giving. And that is a very good kind of mindset to wrap your mind around when we're saying, who is God? What is he like? How is this law system in relationship? So here's another one. Oil and water. So obviously a lot of us know, that oil and water, they can't mix. So basically, there's two properties within them that says when you're like oil, you can't mix with water. So think of it like this. God is water, and water is ultimately a powerful substance. It's a powerful thing as far as like the rushing of water, waves in the ocean, floods, things like that can just destroy humanity, as it obviously did. But also, water is life-giving, it is sustaining, it is something necessary for us to all be a part of. So if you think of that, we were created to be like water. So in the beginning, we were created to have the image of God, to be in the similar substance of God. But what we did was we chose to be like oil. So we have now chosen a character that does not mix with God, that something is off. So what God is doing basically through these ritual laws here in Leviticus and in the Old Testament is he is saying, I want to regain that connection we had between you not being like water, and I'm going to remake you to be like water. I'm going to cover over your oil. I'm going to take those properties away so that once again we can have union back with each other. So I want to pause on both of those and say these actually realities are even carried forward into the rest of the entire Old Testament. So we have just a timeline here of the fall of man where reconciliation was not possible. God went away from mankind. Then for the first time, we have God coming back in intimacy in the tabernacle. It's carried into the tent, and God tabernacles, or he goes to the temple with people where with ritual purity, with these things, when we touch impure things or when we come across impure things, God can heal us or fix that relationship through a sacrifice, through something we have to give up, through something we have to put in our place. So what we see, we get to Isaiah, which is, 1,000 years or so from the time of the first ritual laws given in Leviticus. So in Isaiah, there's this great story where God touches the mouth of Isaiah with a coal, a burning coal. And he says, for the first time, that instead of Isaiah touching something to be impure, God is providing a way to be pure. So he's saying, I'm going to touch something, I'm going to do something to touch you to give you purity. So think of that sun kind of concept of God being this burning coal that's absolutely pure and destructive and powerful and life-giving. And he is now touching the lips of Isaiah and giving him purity. So instead of us always being unpure and having ourselves to sacrifice something, God for the first time is pursuing man and making him pure. Then there's this passage in Ezekiel. So let's think about the water concept. So Ezekiel has this picture of waters, rushing waters coming out of the temple and bringing life to his people. So this is again a change of how God is going to bring holiness and purity and life. God is no longer saying, come to the tabernacle, come to the temple. What he's saying to Ezekiel is there will be a time where the waters will rush out of the temple, out of the presence of God, and that water will be life-giving. So take those two and go then to Jesus. Then we have Jesus. So in this whole concept of holiness and reconciliation with God, we have now separation from God, tabernacle, where when we touch something, when we eat something, when we sin, when we do anything, we have to offer a sacrifice for that right relationship, for us to look holy in God's sight. God says to Isaiah, God says to Ezekiel, something new is going to happen where I'm going to pursue holiness in us, the impure people. God is going to pursue us. So we get to Jesus, and the one thing that makes the Pharisees and the Sadducees so angry with Jesus is Jesus is going around and touching all of these people who are impure. They have skin diseases. The story where Jesus stops a funeral procession and touches this funeral procession in midstream of him saying, I'm going to touch the absolute most impure thing. And not only am I going to touch it, but I'm going to bring him back to life. So Jesus here is saying, I am so holy, I am God in the flesh, yet I am going to touch these impure people and bring them not only into purity, but bring them to life. So if you go through the whole realm of how God is reconciling this sinful relationship, this impurity, this uncleanliness, with God being so holy, he eventually gets to the place where he says, I'm no longer going to touch these people. I'm going to indwell these people. I'm going to purify them. I'm going to come in the Spirit, and through the Spirit, I'm going to purify who they are. I'm going to clean them from the inside out. I'm going to purify their heart, purify their motives, purify their actions. So what we have is Jesus actually says streams of living water will come out of my followers. So this is again kind of touching on that Jesus being the pure water, the life-giving, the powerful nature is going to have streams of living water come out of us. So now God is saying, where it was my role to reconcile relationship with God, now it is the Spirit inside of you, my followers, my church, to make people clean, to make people holy. We are now the tabernacle that people are to come to, or we are actually supposed to go out and bring that relationship back to God. So all those things talking about God's holiness, I want it to be a picture of when we read Leviticus, the whole point of Leviticus is to say there is a broken relationship. And there's a lot of details, there's a lot of reasons why, but mostly it's to say, what is God's character in bringing right relationship back to his people? So if you look at this, God could have just left death and let it happen. But what he does is he provides specific means for him to have holy relationship with his people. God knows of his holiness. He knows of his power. He knows of his mercy and justice. And what he's saying is, I will give you exact descriptions of how to reconcile that relationship. So God knew he could not come in contact with sin. He could not come in contact with death. So what he's doing in Leviticus is he's providing a way for people to be holy, for people to be back in relationship. He's giving them rituals. He's giving them priests. He's giving them sacrifices and saying, right now, this is the only way that I know to give for you to be reconciled with me as a sinful people. And what they really do show is, I know a lot of times we interpret them as there's a lot of legalistic being laws. Legalistic kind of means as far as like, this is really ritualistic and it's not the heart, and God's very firm and these laws never change anything. And it's like, really God's like authority, which seems to be so much in question when we read the Old Testament, is God is showing absolute grace and mercy to his people because of his desire for that relationship. He's basically saying he knows his limitations, but he's willing to do everything possible to show mercy and grace to his people, to say, I'll do everything. I'll dwell in the midst of you. And I know that dwelling in close proximity has these limitations. So I'm going to have priests who have very specific cleansing and purities, so that if the priest has to be utmost holy to get into the Holy of Holies on one day a year, that is the time. So God has these very specific ways that he can reconcile with his people. And one thing that's really interesting is the whole theme of sacrifice is that sacrifice is absolutely needed for God to extend his mercy and grace without compromising his justice. So throughout the entire narrative of the Bible is, without sacrifice, we cannot have God's mercy and grace, because God's justice and God's mercy are always at odds. And without sacrifice, we will always be under the justice of God and never under the mercy and grace of God. So this is what the Old Testament begins. Right here in Leviticus is the heart of a sacrifice is needed. Something is needed to stand in the place to cover our sins so that we can experience God's mercy and grace. So diving into Leviticus, want to say most all of these sacrifices here, you'll see all these different sets of sacrifices and the way to do it. They were for specific sins. So these were for specific areas of their life where they've sinned or had separation or had uncleanliness or had impurities. And one thing to remember is this is not taking the place of saying these sacrifices atone for the sinful nature of humanity. Leviticus never makes that claim. So I know us as New Testament believers say, okay, well, the law never solved the sinful issue. That's correct. It never was intended to. What it was intended to do was to reconcile the separation of holiness between God and man. It wasn't intended to say, we're going to cover the original sin of Adam and make a right relationship with God for all eternity. So try not to read that in. Try to read it as these were specific sins, and God is providing a specific way to reconcile that holiness. The other thing, too, is these sacrifices were not at all a means for human effort to obtain favor. So human effort was not saying, I'm going to sacrifice this to be able to gain favor from God. Something about this is going to give me favor with God. God is doing this to say, we want you to give out, to pour out of yourself, not to try to achieve something. Now, Israel, one of its biggest flaws is they begin to believe that this is giving them some kind of favor with God, or it's a ritualistic effort to do this. So we see that throughout the Old Testament, God had desired their heart in this. He's trying to say, look, when you come to me, I want this relationship. I want you to fear me. I want to provide for you. So these are the ways to do this. I want you to understand that I am gracious. I want you to understand that I have mercy. I want to be your God. I want to guide you by day and by night. I want to lead you into battle and be victorious. I want to do all these things. But to do that, you have to have right relationship with me. And what's really going on is the Israelites begin to say, well, I'm just going to offer sacrifices. I'm just going to offer rituals. And that's really what you asked for. And God's saying, no, I wanted you to realize that I am pursuing you. I'm giving you the option of holiness with the God of creation. And this is the way it has to go. So God always was in desire of genuine faith for the forgiveness of their sins, saying, God, we have sinned. We have done this to our brother. We have done this to our coworker, our slave, or whoever it is. And I need to offer a sacrifice on behalf of that. I'm coming in a state of forgiveness. And there's a lot of sacrifices that are just sacrifices of thanksgiving, sacrifices of worship, sacrifices of praise. And what happened was they just become sacrifices eventually through the Old Testament, and they lost their desire to praise and worship God. So one thing I want to hit on is two kind of concepts that transition into the New Testament. So the main thing with Leviticus, starting here, is to approach God, sin must be dealt with. So the way that it starts being dealt with in the Old Testament is this teachings on rituals and sacrifices. Now, if you get to the New Testament, one thing that could be confusing is Jesus sets up all these teachings that say, I have fulfilled the law, or whatever it may be. If you go through the Sermon on the Mount where it's talking about do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not lie, do not be angry, such and such and such and such. So these are all exact laws that were given in the Old Testament. And Jesus is saying, I'm not saying just to do these things. I want to reinforce that I was always about the heart. I always wanted the heart. He's not saying don't I'm going to abolish adultery. I'm going to abolish do not covet, do not steal, do not whatever it is. I'm not abolishing those things. I'm reminding you that I was always about the heart. So I'm going to give two real quick examples of kind of ways to think about this to reconcile the old law versus Jesus' teaching on the law. So imagine you're learning or you're teaching your kids to ride a bike for the first time. So the first time you're on a bike, you're not thinking, oh my goodness, my kids are going to have so much fun today. We're going to go for the stroll at the park. They're going to be joyful, like nothing bad's going to happen. No, the first day you do that, you give them a bike with training wheels. And the one thing you're focusing on is your kid not falling off or dying or whatever it may be. And what you're really doing is teaching them to balance. You're teaching them, all right, for a little while, you're going to have to learn how to pedal, how to balance, how to get your muscles to move in a way that's coordinated, how to get your hands to move in a way that's coordinated. But the real purpose of bike riding is not balance, is not muscle memory. The purpose of bike riding is traveling, is exercise, is joy, is all those things. So to do the joy and the travel and the exercise, you have to learn balance first because it develops the muscles. So what Jesus is saying in the New Testament is not, you don't need to learn how to balance, just jump on and you'll have the best time ever. No, what he's saying is the laws were good to teach people to balance, to teach people to understand how to pedal, to teach people understand that there is a right way and a wrong way to ride a bike. Those are good parameters. But what he's saying is without those things, you can never experience the joy. You can never experience. So he's saying without a knowledge of what sin and holiness and separation from that holiness is, without knowledge of those things, we'll never understand how to fully know God's love, fully understand his grace, fully understand his mercy. So we have to understand that we are separated from God to understand the lengths at what he went to reconcile that relationship. All right, let me give you another example. So imagine you want to learn an instrument. You don't just pick up, I don't know, a violin or a guitar and just start banging out these great musical encores where you're just nailing these beautiful masterpieces of Mozart. No, what happens when you pick up an instrument? You learn scales. You play scales for years probably, where you're mastering all these different scales. Well, eventually, the goal of playing a musical instrument is for you not to be the best one at playing a scale. That's not the best part of music. The best part of playing an instrument is giving life, giving joy, making beautiful music with that instrument. So what Jesus is saying in the New Testament here is the whole purpose of playing a musical instrument was so that you can give life and beauty. So the whole purpose was not to stay playing scales forever, was I am actually telling you that there's more to playing scales. If you've been playing scales, Israel, if you've been doing ritual sacrifices without the heart and the beauty of what it is for years and thousands of years, then you're gonna miss the point of it. The whole point of the sacrifices was the beauty that comes from knowing reconciled relationship with God. So same thing playing scales is, he's not saying, I want you to play scales forever on a musical instrument. He's saying, I want you to play scales and I want you to eventually get to the point where you're making beautiful music so that you can blow away people, so you can show people the beauty of what that is. So Jesus is not abolishing scales. He's not saying you never need to learn scales. But what he's saying is this is like 2.0 or 201 of a class or something like that. There was a purpose for these things to show the reconciliation of God needed. And now Jesus has come to say there is even a better way, or even there was an original way that wasn't understood that I'm going to make known to you. Being angry, it's not about murdering. It's about if you have anger in your heart, you've murdered somebody. So I want you to know that the laws in Leviticus are absolutely beautiful representations of God's pursuit of humanity. So I want to spend time as you read through Leviticus, as you understand what God is saying. I want you to consistently think, all right, what is God doing to show the length and width and depth of his pursuit for his reconciliation with his people? My character is holy. My character is good. How can I reconcile that relationship with an impure, an unclean, an evil, quote unquote, generation of people? At what lengths can I do this? That I'm going to give very specific instructions of how I'm supposed to reconcile this relationship, how I'm supposed to put forth myself in this over and over again, how that a sacrifice is needed for sin to be dealt with so that we can approach God. So those things are so important that you see it finally reconciled in the New Testament, that our sin must be dealt with to approach God, and Jesus deals with our sin. He is the sacrifice. He is that beautiful picture of reconciliation that comes and stands in our place. And the Day of Atonement in Leviticus has so many overarching themes and beautiful pictures of the Israelites knew that they had to have relationships. So there's one day a year for this to happen. And Jesus says, I'm coming to atone for all time. I'm coming not to deal with just specific sins, but the sin that separated me from God, Adam from God in the very beginning. Jesus is taking that away forever for us through the gift of his presence in the Holy Spirit. So I wanted to go ahead and say, Leviticus is a very difficult read. It is not easy to get bound up. But if you go in with the mentality of God's pursuit for his people and his character to pursue holiness for his people, then you won't get so much lost in the details, because you know that it has a purpose. And still, even in the New Testament, God is pursuing holiness with his people. 1 Peter is consumed with saying, pursue holy, live holy as I am holy. We're supposed to be reflections of God's Son. We're supposed to be a reflection of the water being living streams coming out of us. So I just wanted to give you a prep into Leviticus. I felt like the holiness of God is such a key concept to understand what the purpose of Leviticus is, and also the concept of God doing everything possible to dwell in the midst of Israel as pure holiness, pure power, pure chaos, pure destruction, but also pure joy and life-giving and love, to dwell in that midst without having to compromise his justice, but also to provide a way to mercy and grace for his people. So I hope that helps. I hope this is beneficial to people getting on the board to launch in Leviticus. I love Leviticus. I think it's a really, really beautiful book. We'll talk more about it in our weekly studies. If you guys haven't been to the Bible study, we meet on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock at the building. Feel free to come and join us. Even if you didn't read Genesis or Exodus, Leviticus is a great time to jump in. We're also in the middle, or getting ready to be in the middle of Acts. So pick up the Bible reading. You can find it online if you need to at City Church Knox. Look at those things and just feel free to come and be in awe of God's pursuit of humanity. Thanks, guys.